Welcome to this month's Discover event. I am Sarah and I'm your host today, and thank you for joining us. This Newcastle Discover series is delivered by Newcastle University Alumni Engagement Team and aims to encourage lifelong learning through thought-provoking and insightful events on the latest in university research and practical life skills sessions. The Discover programme for this academic year is aligned to our NCL in Action theme, which is exploring AI's impact on our world. This is our year-long programme of events and volunteering opportunities that are designed to help you explore the ways in which AI and future technologies could potentially change our lives and the way that we work. In the Discover events, expect to dive into the university's cutting-edge research into AI and technology across a variety of disciplines and industries, as well as how AI tools and technology can support us in our everyday lives. So today's session is called AI in the Classroom, the Creativity Engine. So in terms of an overview for you, the blank page, the stuff of which writers' nightmares are made of, most of us will have experienced that dreaded writer's block, not knowing how to continue or even start writing. For young writers who may not yet have developed the strategies to cope with this common issue, a blank page is even blanker. Wouldn't it be great if young writers could count on their favourite authors to help them overcome that challenge? And with the Creativity Engine, they absolutely can. So what is the Creativity Engine? It's an AI-driven web app developed by Newcastle University academics and partners within the city that leverages the hidden power of the archive to help young writers kickstart their creative writing. Seven Stories, which is the National Centre for Children's Books, open their valuable archive filled with drafts, proofs and unpublished materials to help young creatives in their battle against writer's block. This material has been used to fine-tune a text-generating AI capable of opening up the possibilities of any story. Today, we're joined by Tiago Sousa Garcia, who is a senior research software engineer at Newcastle University, and he's going to delve into the origins and the development of the Creativity Engine in much more detail than I've just run through. He'll look at how the idea came about, how it was implemented, and the challenges both in its creation and now to ensure it is kept alive. He will also explore the broader discussion on the relationship between AI and education, its possibilities, limitations, and dangers. So it sounds like a really exciting session. So just to give Tiago a bit more of an introduction, Tiago is a front-end web developer and digital humanist. Before his graduate and postgraduate education in literature, he worked as a software developer and studied computer engineering in Portugal. Between 2017 and 2021, he was a research associate for the ATNU project based at the School of English, where he also taught literary and digital humanities focused modules. In 2020 to 2021, he convened and ran the Coding for Humanists study group, and from 2022, he was one of the co-conveners of the Code community at Newcastle University. Until 2022, he was a co-managing editor of the Journal of the Text Encoding Initiative and an editorial assistant of the Programming Historian. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Tiago.
So thank you, Sarah, for the lovely introduction. As she said, I'm Tiago. I'm a senior research software engineer at Newcastle. My background is mostly in the humanities, but I'm currently working mostly on the technical sides. I've been with university in one form or another since, I think, 2017, which is not that long, but then we had a massive world-shattering event in between that kind of makes distances seem much, much further away. And so today I'm going to talk to you about a project that I did in many senses of the word a couple of years ago called the Creativity Engine. There's a little bit of interaction in this presentation, hopefully. Not too much, because Slido has a free tier that only allows for 3 polls, so that's the extent of it. You will have a little QR code as we go along on the side of the slides as well, but if you want to join ahead of time, this is the time to do it. You can do it by scanning your QR code with your phone, or going to slido.com and inputting that little number there, 1567650. Okay. So here's the problem, as Sarah introduced at the start. The problem that we started with was the blank page. We've all seen it, we've all experienced it, we've all dreaded it in some form or another. The problem that we found to be the hardest was for young creators. So think about teenagers and preteens who have a story to tell, but who might feel, on the one hand, absolutely in awe of all the stories that have been written before them, and on the other hand, not knowing how to begin the story that they want to tell. They might have a story, know what they want to tell, but don't know how to begin. They don't know how to put it into words, right? That experience of the blank page, at least to me, when I was a young writer myself, when I was a young teenager and preteen trying to write something, every time I'd open something new I would either write it immediately or spend 3 hours looking at the blank page. So in the simplest terms, that was the problem that we tried to solve with the creativity engine. And here comes the first activity, right? So if you go to your Slido, have you used any artificial intelligence to help you with the writing task? And that, is easier now. Draft an email, a quick response, start a paragraph, any kind of thing. Have you used it? Overwhelming majority so far. Yes, yes, yes. I'm gonna give a few more minutes. We're about 75 people, I think. I'm looking at about at least 50% participation from the audience here. I can see the numbers on the top corner, so I'm waiting for that. There we go. Then we get to 30 people, but I don't think it will change much more after that. One more. Yeah, I think the overwhelming majority has had some form of AI-assisted writing, particularly if you use any of the, not to be making any publicity here, but if you use any Microsoft product, any new Microsoft product, they all come with a Copilot attached to it, and they will, if you ask it, write things for you or suggest things for you. If you have a new phone, you probably have some form of AI from Samsung or Apple or Google trying to write your emails for you. So it's kind of hard to escape it now. But a few years ago when we started this project, none of this was available. None of this was easily available. So I'm going to move the slide now. I'm going to close at 3/4 of you have used it in the past, give or take. So what is the creativity engine? As Sarah explained at the start, it's basically a text generator designed to help young writers develop their stories. And you can see a little animation there on the right side of a pre-released version of the creativity engine, I think. What makes it unique, or what made it unique at the time, was that we didn't use the general purpose artificial intelligence. We used that as a base, and then we fine-tuned it with archival material from 7 Stories, the National Center for Children's Literature. When we started this project, we had kind of this triple objective. On the one hand, like the initial urge was to support the creativity of young writers, but then we also had more utilitarian perspectives, like introducing the 7 Stories archive. One of the way we thought this could work was you go when you write a story, but you also learn a little bit about the people who helped make this artificial intelligence, about the authors that are featured in the 7 Stories archive. And we also wanted to use this as an opportunity to introduce young people to AI in the time where this wasn't a mainstream conversation, and to help them reflect in the uses of AI for creative practice. So this project was funded and supported in one way or another by Newcastle University, specifically NURI, so the Newcastle University Humanities Research Institute, 7 Stories, who offered us their archive, the Alan Turing Institute, who provided in-kind support, and the English Association, who provided in-kind support and access to teachers and pupils nationwide. So this is kind of the cold opening of my talk. These are the stories I will tell, and forgive me for emphasizing story, but it seems appropriate. There's an origin story, which is going to be the start. And there's a disaster story, which is going to be the live demo, which usually happens in disaster every time it tries to do something like that. Um, Speaking of which, there is a audience story in which I'm going to talk a little bit about how the first users reacted to the creativity engine. There's a challenge story, which is when I'm going to stop being all rosy tinted glasses, and I'm going to tell you about the real difficulties of having this started and continuing. And then a future story about whether or not it's a good idea to keep going with the creativity engine, and the final story, which kind of should bring everything together. Okay, origin story. How did it all came about? So there's a very rough timeline of the creativity engine there in front of you. It started roughly in March 2021. Development begins in September 2021. There's a whole year of what we call co-creation, in which we work with the teachers and the schools and the pupils, but also stakeholders like the English Association and Seven Stories and the Alan Turing Institute. There's a whole year of that before we finally launch the creativity engine. The caveat to have there is that it seems like it's a long time, and it is a long time, but I was the main developer and I work part-time. So in actuality, it's about 6 months of full-time development by one person. Okay, so but let's go back to the first of those circles, the March 2021 English Association Discovery Workshop. So cast your minds back to the world in which we're all still mostly at home. So it's been about a year since the start of the pandemic in Britain. The English Association came up with a way of engaging young creators. And what they were going to do, or they're going to let them take hold of one of their journal issues. And they did, and it's out, and it's called the Quarantines. It's a little pun, Quarantines. Yeah. So as part of that process, the English Association organizes a series of workshops with a purpose of stimulating these young creators, these students who are about, I think about 15, 16 years old. Stimulating those young creators to come up with something original for that issue of the journal. I was invited to talk about the intersection between literature and digital technology, right? And to be honest, I was at a loss. I said yes because I say yes to most things, and then regret regretted terribly. I was a bit of a loss because if there were researchers, if there were academics, then I'd have a huge amount of material to draw from. But for young writers, I didn't really know where to start. You might say I had the blank page problem as well, which I did. But I also had been playing around with artificial intelligence and text generation. All right, so again, remember this is 2021. They had been in the news, but they're not nearly to the extent that they are now. So it was not even close to being a common word, speaking of AI, speaking of GPT in any kind of sense. But at the time, GPT-2, so 2 generations behind our current GPT, was freely available for researchers, for actually anyone who was even a little bit technically minded. So I made a few experiments at home, and I figured out that maybe we could use this kind of generation in some form for literary creation. And I was thinking maybe this could be kind of an engine for creativity, hence the creativity engine. That's what we called it. Okay, so here's our first bit of interaction proper. I think you probably guessed that this was going to happen, but I'm going to ask you to identify what has been AI generated and what is real. Okay, so we have 3 starts of stories here. You're going to have to take your pick now, because when I moved to the bit where you can actually make the selection, you won't be able to read the story and I won't be able to go back. So we're going to spend some time here. You have 3 options. Option A. It was a crisp, sunny morning in London, and Paddington Bear was sitting on the steps of the Browns family's house, carefully unwrapping a rather large bundle. This option A. Is this AI generated? Let's find out. Option B. Paddington woke with a start, and after blinking several times in order to accustom his eyes to the evening light, peered round the deck of the liner Karenia with a puzzled expression on his face. Option C. The Browns' house at number 32 Windsor Gardens was unusually quiet. It was a warm summer day, and all the family, with the exception of Paddington, who had mysteriously disappeared shortly after lunch, was sitting on the veranda enjoying the afternoon sun. Right. So you have to pick which one has been generated by an artificial intelligence. A, B, or C. Make your pick now and vote. Which one has been generated by AI? A, B, or C? Exciting. Ooh. Well, I think I put it to show it at the end. That's why I didn't want to influence. I forgot. I was wondering why it doesn't show up. That's why. It always show when I click next. Oh boy. Right, so I'm going to give it a couple more seconds. I'm going to try to get to 50 participants at least. Come on. A, B, or C, which one is the AI generated story? 3, 2, 1. Let's look at the results. Oh, interesting. So most of you think that the AI generated story is B. Some big division between B and C, and almost no one thinks A has been generated by an AI. Hope I'm reading these results correctly. Right, so your winner is, I'm going to read it from my notes because I can see it here. Paddington woke with a start and after blinking several times in order to accustom his eyes to the evening light, peered round the deck of the liner Karenia with a puzzled expression on his face. This is what you think is AI generated. So let's see if you're right. You are not right. In fact, both majority answers that you thought could be the AI generated are both actual works by Michael Bond. They're both actual stories. Paddington at Work is the one in which he's peering around the deck of the liner Karenia, and More About Paddington is the one where they are all enjoying something in the veranda. AI generator has been, it was a crisp sunny morning London in Paddington. They were sitting on the steps of the Brown family's house, carefully unwrapping a rather large bundle. Obviously, I cut a lot of the story. I got a huge amount of story. I'm happy to share that actually later if you want. Interesting results you could not see. There's kind of the opposite thing, but it's not a poll. So it's just for you to think about which of these stories is not AI generated. So we're going to have to pick the real one. There are 2 fake ones, 1 real one. This is not a poll because Slido has a limit of 3 questions and I have another one still. So, but it's just for you to think to yourself and see how well you're doing identifying real stuff. The snow fell gently over the town, a blanket of white that covered everything in sight. It was the kind of snow that made the streets look soft and quiet, the sort of snow that invited you to pause and take a breath, the sort of snow that turned ordinary things into something magical. Or B, it was the sort of day that made you want to stay indoors. The sky was grey and heavy with clouds, the sort of clouds that seemed to hang just a little too low as if they might fall any minute. The wind blew in sharp gusts, rattling the windows, and the rain came down in a fine, steady mist. Once upon a time, see, down at the bottom of the world, there was a sad little island. No one lived in the sad little island except for a few poor shepherds. These poor shepherds spent all their time counting their sheep and eating them. Right. So think to yourselves, which one do you think is the real story? So which one of these is not AI generated? And let's see if you are correct. So A and B are both AI generated, and C is The Tin Pot Foreign General and The Old Iron Woman by Raymond Briggs. And there's a little bit of a caveat as well. A and B have been generated by asking, can you write me a story in the style of Raymond Briggs? So they were purposefully trying to follow the same kind of style, the same way that the Paddington stories were following the Michael Bond's Paddington style. Okay, so this is for you to keep in the back of your mind. It's the big question of AI and creativity, where does the line lie and what you can do with it. I'm going to pause on this for a moment to go back to that March 2021 when I was talking to students and offering them generation that was nowhere near as good as this one. In fact, I dug up the original story of what I've done. So what I've done there was I've pre-generated um, a few stories or starts of stories, and I took it to them without telling them how I had come across that, right? I just said, I wrote this story. Can you help me figure out what's wrong, what I've done, what's good about it? And one of the stories that I took was this one. Detective Summer listened carefully, but heard no sound. Perhaps the faintest whisper, perhaps a small groan of approval had awakened the boy. A small one, at 15 years old, but with a face, and a face full of uncertainty. He sat up, shaking his head. You've been here, haven't you? He asked, his voice thick with fear. Yes, Summer said, looking down at him. The boy's gaze still on Summer. And bless them, they were very kind about it. They said, oh, this is interesting. There's something a bit off about it. We can't really tell what. They were very kind and very surprised when I actually told them, again, remember 2021, that this had been generated by an AI. This was generated, in fact, by GPT-2, which, again, 2 generations behind the current model. And what I did with them afterwards was to start using a few prompts and see what they could come up with. I mean, at the time, again, there was no easy interface to interact with GPT, with the model. So I had to show the students the inner workings, that is the actual code that could make it work. And they were fascinated, of course. But the fact that there was no interface, no way for a regular person to interact with this text generating AI, limited the ability of young writers to use this as a tool. So this was the start of the creativity engine. What if we could, on the one hand, train a large language model, an AI, to write the kinds of stories that people of their age are used to reading, and at the same time create an interface that allows young writers to take advantage of that model and use it as a way to start their writing, to find out where the story could go, all sorts of stuff. One of the things that they liked very much at the time was that the generation was far from perfect, and sometimes it was ridiculous, and that was kind of almost like a crack to creative side. Like suddenly there was a talking fish in the middle of the story, and they were like, "Oh yeah, that's kind of interesting." It made no sense, but it was enough to spark them into a different direction. The reaction was quite surprising. They were actually delighted by it, and um, they were really interested in the possibility of using it themselves. So that's where the idea came from. So I'll spare you the ins and outs of the actual bureaucratic process around it, but it turns out that I moved positions in between that initial encounter and the start of development. So I moved from being an RA in the School of English to being in the position that I am now as a research software engineer. And the job that landed first on my desk was the creativity engine. In that meantime, in between March and September, when I started developing, we had approached and several stories as a possible partner for the project. They'd agree to share the archive. We used this to refine the text generating tool. And when I started working on it, I was paired with a colleague called Catherine Garside, who is more on the artificial intelligence, machine learning side of things. I'm more on the interface, kind of user experience side of things. And together we set out this work plan for us. So what we started by doing was something called data processing, in which we took images from the archive. We did what's called OCR, or optical character recognition of those images, and pre-process the result into what's called training materials, which is then used to do model development, which is the point in which we pick up a large general purpose model like GPT-2, for example. We fine-tune its generation to be more in tune with the kind of story that we want, which is what is the 7 stories archival material, and we put in some mitigations for taking into account inappropriate content, considering that the application was meant to be used by school children. And at the same time, we developed and designed the user interface and the user experience. And then we do some deployment, we do some user testing, we balance performance and cost of deployment options. I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. It's still working. At the same time, we set up a process of co-creation. And this is because from the start, we were keen to involve everyone from the stakeholders to the actual users. So it's a fairly simple circle to understand. We develop something, we go to test, to to test it with stakeholders and hear their feedback, and that's NURI, so Humanities Research Institute, 7 Stories English Association. We then take it to teachers and pupils, and that's been organized by the English Association mostly, so we'd have like little workshops with them every now and then. They would experiment what we had, give us feedback, and then we integrate that feedback in the development and go back to stakeholders, go back to teachers and pupils, and so on and so forth. Right, so this is the scary bit. This is the disaster story. Let's see how badly this could go. There's to say it's the demo. So I'm going to do this on the screen, but feel free to go to this address, creativity-engine.newcastle.ac.uk, and play around for yourself as I'm speaking. I'm not going to do anything too long and too convoluted. I'm just going to show you the ins and outs of the Creativity Engine. I hope you can see it. This should be an orange front page with a few authors. Creativity Engine, right, with the 7 Stories archive. So these are the authors that we've used to train our model. We'll go through them in a little bit. I'll just do some of the generation. The idea is you personalize yourself a little bit. You look at choose your avatar. Let's see, I'm a balding man with the mustache, which seems appropriate. And then there's a little tool that tells you how to use the Creativity Engine. So I'm not going to read everything of that, but it sort of guides you through the various bits of the Creativity Engine. Gives you an example. Could be is basically doing what I'm going to do next, which is to tell you how these things work. Right. So this is how you start your generation. Like, and one of the first things that pretty much everyone, stakeholders and students, told us is actually the first sentence is the more important bit. But the first sentence is the one we can't give you, right? So the way the way this particular model works, you need to start something for it to keep going. So what we did was we hard-coded a huge number of first sentences to serve as a starting point that you can then go back and replace. So if you click the Start Me Off button, you get a bunch of pre-written first sentences, and you can use that to start with. So let's say you start your story with a damp morning mist wrapped around the trees, rolled around the chimneys, you submit that. You wait for a little bit, and then the group of authors comes back to you with hopefully a generation. I don't think we ever used it with so many people at the same time. So let's see. Oh, there we go. And you have 3 options, 3 possible generations, and you decide where you want to go. The damp morning mist wrapped around the trees, floated around the chimneys at the old stone kilns. They were silent as if the wind had stopped for the moment. And then you keep going with your story. You could not hear a pin drop. You could hear a pin drop. Silence was deafening, or something like that, and see where this goes. It might go somewhere, it might not go anywhere interesting. Let's see. And you're wondering what to do in another voice scream that you too. So there's a little jump for something else in the story, or there's something that is more like keeping the same vein. All the noise in the village, the sounds, the laughter. You could, but then out from somewhere down the street, you could hear the sound of a car driving slowly. So there's either you keep going the same vein, or there's a little change for you, and you keep going. Almost ad infinitum. There's a limit to what you can do here, and there's a limit to how much text you can write, as well, for reasons that will hopefully become clear later on. But that's essentially how it's designed to work. It's not meant to, unlike current AIs, it's not meant to write an entire story for you. It's meant to help you piece by piece, to help write as you go along. So if I wrote here, write me a story in the vein of Paddington, it wouldn't know what to do. It would just try to keep going from that sentence, basically. There's a little about section that tells you a little bit of the story that I just told you. But the more important bit is this bit in which we talk a little bit about the author. So this is kind of the point where we wanted to bring people into the Solvent Stories archive. So you can go to John Agard, for example, can read a little bit about John Agard, see some of his bibliography, but also see some of the pages that we actually used to train the AI. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. That's essentially what it is. There's a few settings that will let you explain. One of the things that we were surprisingly asked to do was to, sorry, there's a bit of flashing here, was to have the chance of customizing how it looks, because that's something that the students wanted. So we implemented that, for example, as well. Okay, I'll let you um, explore it while I'm doing the rest of the talk, but I'm going to move on from now, if I can. Let's see if I can. This is the tricky bit. I'm going to close that. Hopefully you're still seeing Creativity Engine, the link. Yes. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the audience story. That is how people reacted to it. And again, there's a little and final slide though. If you had a chance to experiment by yourself, or if you just saw me do something, just write a couple of things. Like, I think you're only allowed to write one word at a time, so a couple of objectives, to see to tell me what you think of it, basically. In general terms, it could be anything. I'm not trying to influence you, but was it like amazing? Was it brilliant, inspiring? Did it spark creativity? Easy to use? Let's just see what comes up. Yes, and you can see how easily biased these kinds of polls could be. Give you a few seconds to do that. I'm going to spend too much time. See if we can get to 20 without too much time. 20 people. Interesting, promising. Cool. Fun, promising, interesting. See, there's 8 people writing, I think. I can really see because oh, just give these 7 people time to finish. Okay, right. So interesting, which is kind of a non-committal reaction, which is good to see. Fun to explore, good to see, good start, little tedious, understandable, busy for first-time users, yes. Is it AI? Yes, it is AI. Is it good AI? That's a different question. Like to try, yeah. So the promising and the I would like to try and stuff like that is the problematic bit that we're going to talk about towards the end. Okay, the reason why I asked you to give your first thoughts is because I asked the same thing of students a few years back in some workshops that we did with them. So we visited 4 colleges in Northern England: Cambridge Regional College, Reese Heath College, Joseph Chamberlain College, Collinsdale College. These happened in around October 2022, I think. Half of these were in person, half of these were online. We had between 10 and 20 pupils in each session. The age range of those pupils was around 15, 16, which is a little older than the target audience of the Creativity Engine, but it was mostly due to the developability that the teachers who were involved in the project had and the classes that they had to share it with. The workshop that we did was 2-hour workshop in which they were first asked to test the app without any or minimal contextualization. It was just like, go to this address, play around with it, see what you can find. And then they were asked about ease of use, about what did they thought about it, which was kind of the general first question. Then we had different sessions in which I had different versions of the models for them to try to see if there was any difference or any perceived difference in the results. And then we've asked them to share their thoughts more specifically on those results with different models. And we've also asked them to contribute for the starting prompts. So some of the those prompts were written by the students who helped us create the Creativity Engine. Right, so this is what they thought. And as I said, while we were doing this same exercise, these kinds of questions are easily led. So take it with a grain of salt, even though part of the spiel in these workshops was, I don't want, praise. I want you to find problems with it. I want you to find the errors and the bugs. I want you to tell me, honestly, that kind of stuff. But there's always a kind of innate tendency to try to be a nice person and say nice things about someone else's work. But generally, you can see they're good idea, easy, helpful, useful, think, write, I found, they're all positive in some sense. But perhaps the more relevant question was, I think it was towards the end, and towards the end of the workshop, we asked, how likely are you to use the creativity engine when it's launched? And there's a bit of, it's not completely biased towards the positive side. There's a bit of some people are saying they're not very likely or unlikely to use it, which is good from my perspective, because it validates the overwhelming majority that are indeed willing to use the creativity engine or looking forward to using the creativity engine. There was a lot more data that we collected from these workshops that I either am not able to share here because of privacy concerns. A lot of the answers were free text, so people might have shared things that they're not comfortable with for general release, or others are simply boring, which is, you like this version better than the other version. It's kind of A/B testing, which is not very fun. So all this has been very interesting, very nice, very positive so far, but it's time for the challenge story. Right, so what are the challenges? We had plenty of challenges doing this. It started from the very beginning, there's a saying, data science is 99% preparation, 1% misinterpretation. And we were definitely took our turns with the 99% preparation. So the data that we used, training data, this is what it is, basically, or a version of this is what it is. It's just long shelves with lots and lots of physical notebooks, printouts, documents, text in that form. To use it in any sense to train an AI, we had to develop a workflow that would go from hopefully a digital image to training data, which is textual files with not doc files, txt files with no other formatting or anything like that. It initially proved a little bit tricky because we didn't have all the images at the start, and we had an imbalanced training data set, which was more at the start a lot poetry, not as much fiction. But by the end, we've eventually processed around 8,000 images of varying quality. So the OCR process was really tricky because on the one hand, we have things like this, which are fairly easy to read for a human and for a machine. So at the end of the OCR process, you have a very readable text, but then you have things that are not so great because we have annotations, we have corrections by hand, but even then it's not terrible. And then you have things that are really impossible to read. So the process that we had to do is, on the one hand, we had to manually review every single image OCR to make sure that the text was good. Ideally, we would have automated the entire process, but we didn't have the time or the funding to do it. So eventually we settled on, took the image, we did the OCR, we then did any manual cleanup, and then we did any manual correction, and then it became training data. So all this process took the majority of our time for the first few months of the project. Eventually, we got some help from JobSocs, so jobs on campus, and from other people around the university, and we managed to process those 8,000 images. The more technical bit coming up, the way it works is that we have a web app, which is the stuff that you see, that talks to an AI inference model, which is the stuff that you don't see that's in the background. And that bit generates text and returns that to the web app that you see. And that's how you see the conversations from the start. This is an example of an early user interface. And from the start, it's always been in this idea of a conversation between you and the group of authors. It's now looking much prettier. The user interface was written in Flask, if you're technically minded and a bit curious about how we got there. The AI inference, that little bit at the end, has actually more than one thing. You actually have two things. One of the things is the model itself, which is a very big collection of weights. I don't want to get too technical. But that's kind of the way you decide what word you're going to suggest next. You're going to throw some words through that, and whatever comes out at the end of it, passing all those weights, that's the suggestion. That's one part of it. The other part of it is kind of the compute that picks up the input, throws it at the model, and gets back a response. And that's called the inference API. And it's very resource intensive to have those two things working all the time in the cloud. Not just resource intensive, but very expensive, right? So we couldn't just put that on your phone. It would not work. I mean, maybe it works now, but at the time it would not work. You had to make this inference happening somewhere else, and that happening somewhere else is expensive. You have some costs that I collected at the time when I was doing this bit, and to have it continuously on and continuously working, we were looking at a minimum £400 a month. There was no way beyond that, and there's no way we could afford that. So that was another one of the big challenges. There's no way we can keep this working on, available for everyone 24/7 at these prices. It simply couldn't do it. And for a long time, we had no idea how to solve it. But eventually, we came across a specific, and again, more technical bit, specific solution called the asynchronous endpoint, which is from AWS. And the way it works is, instead of having a machine working 24/7, asking you, waiting for a question to generate, you have a queue. And every time that queue has something come in, so every time I ask for a generation, there's a signal that gets sent to a machine that gets turned on if it's not on, and that machine will do a generation, will put it in what's called a data bucket, which is that bucket image on the side, and say back, I've made your generation, it's ready now, go fetch it at this place. And then your user interface needs to go to that bucket, get the generation, and display it. There's kind of there's a break in between. There's now what's called real-time inference is asynchronous, right? So you do the inference, and then sometime later you get the result. The advantage of doing that is that if you have no generation, you can turn off that machine. So it doesn't cost you £400 a month. If you can turn it off every time it's not being used, it costs much, much less. I think now with our current usage is somewhere between £0 and £10 a month. So we've been getting just for the inference process. But there's a downside. And the downside is that once we I'm running out of time, so I'll be quick now. Once we get to if we manage to turn off the machine every time we start it back on, it takes about 5 minutes for it to be available, right? So a lot of people who go and try to access a generation engine, not during a presentation like the one I was doing now, in which I primed the thing and turned it on ahead of time, will find a very long wait, and that's kind of disappointing for them, understandably. So, right, the future. What's happening with the performance now, right? Remember, we developed this a few years ago, way before this big revolution with GPT-3 and GPT-4 became widespread. So the creativity engine is generally slower than other modern chat interfaces. As I just said, it has a very long wake-up time, so it takes about 5 minutes if no one has used it for a while. And the results are just not as good as modern large language models. So you have an idea. This measures parameters. I'm not going to go into much detail, but in simple terms, is the amount of number of knobs and dials you can adjust to make a better result. And usually the more parameters, the more versatile the model, so the more general purpose it can be. We used as a base that model on the left is called GPT Neo 1.3b that has 1.3 billion parameters. At the time, the state-of-the-art available was GPT-2 that had 1.5 billion parameters. Shortly after, during development, we had GPT-3 come out that had, let me see on my notes, how many? 1.175 billion parameters, so a huge jump in general purpose. And now GPT-4 has 1.76 trillion parameters. So the model that we're using right there is not even visible on the graph. As I said, it's not a straightforward measure of the quality of the model, but it is indicative of the potential of the model, right? So the potential of GPT-4 to do something better is many orders of magnitude bigger than the model that we're using. The other big challenge we're having is about teacher support. So at the start, we created this teacher pack that had ideas for activities with the creativity engine in the classroom, but that is now out of date. It needs more work to be workshopped with teachers, to be further developed, to have updates, to integrate better with the national curriculum. So it would basically need continuous development for it to be useful. And once again, we come back to the question of price. So right now, the total cost per month of the creativity engines around anywhere between 50 and £100 because we have the interface and we have the AI inference. But even if we ignore the interface bit, like ChatGPT is free for everyone. You can go and use it and you get better results, right? If you want to use at an advanced level, you can pay for £20 a month yourself, right? If we were to put a large language model, a contemporary one, online now, you are looking at those prices on the right, at the cheapest, still around £400 a month. And even then, you'd have then the model costs, which is, companies like OpenAI would charge you to use their model. Then you have the training costs with how to use computers to make it better. And then you have training data, which you have to buy somewhere to improve your model. So it just becomes impossible and unsustainable to keep going with the creativity engine. But we have learned a lot of things with it. We have learned that there is a need and an appetite for this kind of AI application. Teachers told us many times that we're so happy we have this now because we can interact with students in a different way. We can offer them a different type of experiences, just not the reading and writing that they used to. It brings AI into the creative process in a sort of managed way and hopefully helps students develop their skills more autonomously without having to have constant feedback from teachers. And it did, from that survey that we did with students, it did increase their curiosity about both AI and the specific authors that we used. So why is it coming to an end? It was an experiment. It was an experiment. It was never meant to be a long-term application. It has been overtaken by current technology. It still requires a good amount of funding just to keep it going, let alone to make it, competitive in any case. But the need for these safe and guided spaces, which is what we try to do, we try to be very guided and very safe, right? There's limits to what you can get from the creativity engine that are there on purpose. Those limits there's still a need for that because it's different sending a student to ChatGPT and see what comes up there. Yeah, that's about it. I've run out a little bit from what I wanted. There's a few people I need to thank. They're on this slide, specifically Catherine Garcia, which was my co-developer at the start, and Jennifer Richards, who was kind of the big force behind this project. They deserve thanks, but everyone in that slide deserves a big round of applause. And thank you all for listening to me.
Fantastic, Tiago. That's been really interesting. We do have some time now for a Q&A. So if you do have any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A section on Zoom. And I will work through as many as we can in the time that we have remaining. To kick things off, I have a question. As someone who has lots of experience in this area in using AI to, generate content and writing and things, are you able to easily identify when AI is being used in a
No.
piece of writing yourself? No?
No, not at all, not at all. I mean, that's kind of the point of those first questions is that now with current models, they are, particularly if they're without context, if you don't know the context in which that might have been or not been generated, they're very, very hard to identify. And particularly if the person who used that generation was intelligent enough or smart enough to copy edit it a little bit, right? Because there are things that in very long generations that you can kind of tell. There are certain bits that don't make sense in a way that humans would not make sense, if that makes sense. I know, kind of talking in
Yeah.
circles here, but there are inconsistencies that you expect from humans, and there are inconsistencies that you don't expect from humans, and sometimes those inconsistencies, the second kind, show up, and you can see. But if someone went through the generation again and just did a little bit of editing, you can easily get rid of those, and it'll be very hard to identify. The easiest way to identify AI generated text from a human perspective is, again, if it hasn't been edited, AI has a big tendency to lie and to make up things. So you'll have references to works that don't exist. You have, assertions of things that are patently wrong, like bananas are blue or something like that. Obviously not as bad as that, but that kind of thing. But
Yeah.
otherwise, without context and without even the option, at least in my poll, I told you there would be one or two that were AI generated, but if you didn't have that, I doubt anyone would even think that would be AI generated.
Yes, yeah, it was quite a hard exercise. So we have got a couple of questions coming in. So, would you say that this is suitable for a range of ages, especially in regards to teaching primary school children, or is it more suitable for older students? I did spot that you did work with like 15 to 16-year-olds, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah.
But is it suitable for younger children as well?
Yes, with the caveat of use it under supervision, of course, don't let it go. We have so that came up as a big question during the development. I didn't have time to go into it, but one of the things we're concerned was about safeguarding
Hmm.
because the mod at the time that we were developing our models, there many stories came about. You know, you had that AI bot that was the Microsoft one that suddenly became very racist within a day of Twitter, something like that. So all that was in the back of our minds. And that played a part in the model that we chose as a base. So we didn't go with an open AI model, not a GPT, because the training data that they used is a lot less curated than the one that we used in our model, that was used in our model. Our model was used by a company called Illuthor AI, which is an open source company, and they trained it in a more curated data set rather than just everything on the internet. It was a much more selected kind of pile. That made it um, less versatile from the start, but it also made it less likely to veer into offensive territory. So that was one of the things that we did to try to implement some safeguarding. The other thing is we use another AI who's trying to detect whether there is racist or xenophobic or sexist or any kind of inappropriate generation coming back from the AI, and if it does, kind of doesn't even show you, it asks for another kind until it passes that test. That, of course, is not infallible because it is itself an AI. So there are things that you can pass, make it pass. And then there's a very simple filter as well. There was a request from the teachers, which is about profanity. I was never very concerned about profanity, to be honest, because, they're words. That doesn't matter. Ideas are more dangerous than words, but teachers requested it, so we added it. And so if the text profanity, it doesn't completely stop the generation, but it does hide it away a little
Yeah,
bit. So there's all these sorts of safeguarding options, but ultimately you can never predict what AI is going to come up with. And the big caveat is it is suitable for younger ages if you're doing it under supervision. If you're just letting a child do it by itself, they probably they have the potential to find things that are less suitable for their age. In terms of the quality of the stories, they're actually fairly well suited because most of the material that we had were for younger ages rather than so it wasn't really younger adult fiction. It was more of like short stories kind of level of stuff. So the kinds of stories you can generate with it are more suitable actually for younger children than they are for older children.
great. So I'm going to just merge a couple of questions together. So obviously with AI, there's a lot of concerns around, things being identified as plagiarism. Is that an issue with the creativity engine? And can you suggest any tools that can check if a piece of writing is AI generated? Is there anything out there to kind of show or prove that?
Okay, so the first part of it is an issue is always an issue, but this kind of inbuilt in the creativity engine, the inability to use it for for plagiarism because the amount of text you get back before you're required to add to the story is very, very small. It's about I can't remember what the limit is, the limit I put in. It's malleable, but it's about I think it's no more than a paragraph tops. It's less than a paragraph really. So after it generates that less than a paragraph, you are required to continue the story in some sense. And if you just say continue the story, then the story just derails. So you are required to have some input. So it kind of has that inbuilt anti-plagiarizing bit. Of course, there are phrases that sometimes occur. There's actually a few cases. There's very interesting. So one of the authors that we used had a character called Wrigley, and occasionally the character itself would pop up in generations. So you tells your story, and then the character's name becomes Wrigley. Not it wouldn't be any kind of defining features for the character, but the name would appear. So those kinds of things can happen with Creativity Engine, but as I say, because there's so strict limits on the generation, on the amount of generated text that you can get, it's not really an issue. Um, the other part of the question, I wish I could. I know there are people who are researching ways of identifying what's been generated text, but I don't know of any specific applications that make good use of it. I'm sure there will be people on the market claiming that, but from my understanding, and take with a pinch of salt. As I said, I've worked on this a couple of years ago. I'm not working on it currently. I don't think there's a fail-safe way of identifying AI-generated text yet.
Yeah, it's still lots to be developed, I think, isn't there? So we have had a couple more questions, but we are rapidly running out of time. So unfortunately, we are going to have to wrap things up there. But I just want to say a huge thank you to Tiago. Again, it's been a really interesting session, and I hope people have enjoyed learning about the creativity engine. We do have further events coming up. We've got our NCL Develop workshop series, which is focused on leveraging the power of AI for startups. And our next Discover session is taking place in a hybrid format. So if you're local to the university, you're welcome to join us in person. Or alternatively, we will be streaming that live. And that session is AI and the music industry. Can AI truly create an original piece of work? And we have another Discover coming up in February as well, which is the future of AI is on the edge. So please do take a look at our website or scan the QR code that's on screen there if you'd like to find out more about our upcoming events. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Tiago, for the session. It has been really interesting. We hope to see you at another event soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.